Okay, now let's talk about Agile in the Department of Defense. So when it comes to Agile, there are lots of examples of Agile being employed by the DoD. And in fact, the biggest one is the new background check system, the background investigation system that's being developed by DISA. As many of you may know, in the United States, the Office of Personnel Management was hacked in 2015, and basically everyone who works for the government, their information was potentially compromised, and so that's a huge breach. It's affected something like 1 in 10 or so people. It's just crazy. The reality is that as a result of that, there was an order that now the Army is taking over what used to be a civilian job of doing background checks and securing the data. To do that well, the Army, or I should say DISA, and I apologize, I don't mean to offend anyone, DISA is using a process called an Other Transactional Authority, OTA, and that is a system by which a prototype is developed based on a white paper. So a proposal is offered to do a prototype, which then is elaborated into a minimum viable product, which is then elaborated into a full operational capability. And so this iterative development is being used at the biggest scale for one of the most important projects out there. So that's one example. Another example is actually a project that I did for the Navy, and I mentioned this in the week 1 course. And it's actually a project where we were developing a decision support system for the Navy. And so the Navy needed a way to pick projects that were going to affect the energy use of buildings, either the type of energy the building was using, turning it from brown power or dirty power to green power, renewables, or it was going to make the buildings more efficient by changing the lighting or the HVAC systems or adding insulation, etc. So the way that we did this was over the course of about 4 years, we iteratively improved on the system, and it was actually an application of the theory of constraints along with Agile principles, and we ran it as a Scrum team. So we had to develop our requirements, we implemented our system, we had increments that we showed to our product owner, which was the program manager, someone who's a GS-14, that's a very high up civilian within the military, who is paired with an O6, which is a captain, in this case in the Navy. They approved our increments and said, good job, or this needs to change. We also worked with their action officers who are actually going to be using the tool. They were our primary stakeholders. And then also 240 installations throughout the world. We had lots of feedback. They were a larger stakeholder group that also told us that the tool is working. The first step was improve their data quality. That was essential because their data was not in good shape. In that process, we were able to correct a number of measures that identified project feasibility and helped to avoid a bunch of bad projects. Then the next step was to improve the project selection process. And one of the biggest things that was identified was that the EROI formula that was being used to rank the different types of benefits a project could offer. It could be financial benefits, it could be reducing energy, it could be putting in infrastructure that was going to help the next project. One of the biggest things that we identified was that those projects, once you corrected the formula, you could now pick much better projects if you ranked by EROI and did so effectively, and we corrected the scoring. So the scoring allowed us to improve the selection by another $30 million in terms of the impact score. And so finally, after saving $50 million in net present value per year, that the project was there. And the project was only about $1.25 million a year. So the Navy was making a lot of money. We then went about identifying new projects for them to invest in. And the reason why is because the Navy was believing at the time that they were finding all the best projects and funding them in year 1, and then funding the less good projects in year 2, and even the lesser good projects in year 3. But what was actually going on is that they were funding some of all, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And the reality was that they couldn't identify which ones were good and bad fast enough to feed the machine of picking projects. So we developed instead a tool to help identify the projects that would be good so that they could go audit those buildings, which is basically investigating them for projects, and then develop projects to make those buildings more efficient. And that was a very powerful tool to help show the Navy that they could do better. In fact, better than they were actually improving on their savings every year as opposed to decreasing because they hadn't found the best projects yet, and we were helping them do that. And then finally, they needed to track those projects, and that was the last thing that we did for them. And that was important for ensuring that the savings were happening, because things can happen in a project that can go awry. So there's an example of the theory of constraints. We were constantly identifying what was the number one thing that we needed to improve, and as the constraint on the system moved, we then focused on that constraint and subordinated all other processes and lifted. So we went through the 5 steps of progressive ongoing improvement. So now let's talk about Kelly Johnson's 14 rules of management. Now, there was a comment about whether or not this was really agile. And in fact, I wanted to bring up those rules here and just kind of call out a few key ones, because these rules are definitely agile. And we can start with the first set of 7. The first one says that the Skunk Works manager must be given the complete practical control of their team. In other words, the team must be strong and it must be able to direct its own work. Separate from the rest of the organization, they must report straight to the top. So this is the idea of having strong self-directed teams. They also must have project offices that are both military and industry. That meant that both the vendor and the owner were on the same team, whole teams as we describe them. The number of people were supposed to be small teams, agile teams. Very simple drawings were supposed to be released with great flexibility for changes. And this is the idea that we value documentation and a plan, but we want to respond to change because we know we're going to learn as we go. They also said there must be a minimum number of reports and that we wanted to use people and their ability to talk to each other over reports, because that just added burden to the system. So that's people, individuals over processes and tools. Individuals' interactions are always going to be more effective. And if you have small, strong teams, you don't need all that reporting. Then it said that there must be a monthly cost review in order to know how much has been committed and how it's burning down. Effectively, that's a burn down chart. Again, these are tools that we talk about later in the course, but there you go. And the contractor must be delegated and assume more than the normal responsibility to get good vendor bids. And this is the idea that budget is not your main cost. In fact, your biggest cost is delaying getting this capability into the field. And so don't go cheap. Go for best value. And that's a very agile principle. The next 7 rules talk about inspections, that there shouldn't be duplicate inspections, that the vendor should be able to close their own work, but that this process of closing work on the development of a new plane or piece of or part of the plane actually had to be approved by the Air Force and the Navy. What that means is they had a definition of done, and once that definition of done and the understanding of the intent was clearly met, closed. The contractor then must be delegated the authority to test their own product. That's the idea of continuous integration. Then it also says that all of these specifications must be made upfront about what the constraints are for hardware. And this is really important, again, as we are going to talk about here in a second, when it comes to constraints. How you constrain the solution must be upfront so that people can know that when they go to solve the problem on the team. That's the development team's opportunity. Funding the program should be timely. There must be trust, which is, of course, the core central need in any agile team is trust between the vendor and the military. And if the trust is not there, this can't work. And then, of course, the last 2 are all about, again, limiting access to the team so the team can focus, and then being sure that they're able to maintain good performance with team members who are well compensated. And that's about taking money off the table. It's a big deal so that you have team members focus on their job, not trying to manage each other. So if we take a look at these all together, what you see is that small, strong, self-directed teams account for a number of the rules, as well as owners and vendors on the same team, managing and responding to change, minimizing reports, and then finally incremental development and testing.